Let's talk a little bit about the Geniza. In 2 sentences, many of you will be aware of the fact that sometime around a century or so ago, actually in 1896, a treasure trove was brought back to the United Kingdom full of varied and various documents which over the years have been published or glimpsed in various forms. And really, in 2 sentences, that is it. But clearly, there's a lot more to it. And what I'd like to do this evening is, first of all, discuss the specifics of what was found, and then deal with who and how and when. And perhaps we'll start with a very general question, and for that we can go to the wording and the synagogue. Yep, the wording, we'll start with the wording. A Geniza is a repository for books, for Sforim, that have passed their sell-by date. And generally speaking, because people tend to be somewhat OCD about these things, we end up putting into the Geniza many things that have no job being there in the first place. But because they've got a Hebrew word on, if somebody drew up a shopping list at the top of which they might have written B'siyata Dishmaya, that goes into the Geniza. Alongside all sorts of artifacts which fill boxes and cupboards worth of unnecessary junk. And under normal circumstances, this would be a problem. In the case of Cairo, it was a window onto the world, because held within this one synagogue were tens of thousands of very varied and very different documents. Now, if we go to the next slide, this is a photo of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. Initially, it was located in an area called Fustat, which was separate to the main city of Cairo. Over time, it has become swallowed up within the expansion of the capital city of Egypt, and therefore nowadays it is simply part of the city towards the south. Now, this is a photo of the synagogue which I actually took back in 1990. I was newly married, and we were studying, I was actually learning in Kollel in Jerusalem, and we didn't really have a budget for vacation. So I found an advert that promised us 2 nights in Cairo for $25 a night. And lo and behold, that was our summer break. We ended up, I must say, in a beautiful 5-star hotel there. And one morning, we went to see the Ibn Ezra Synagogue. And we are traipsing through the Santa Barbara Monastery complex. And I'm sure that we've gone wrong. There's no signage, we have no idea where anything is. But lo and behold, we come across this synagogue. It is, to this day, surrounded by different Christian churches and buildings. And we walked into the synagogue, and it is not, I don't know if I can do anything with this. Will this laser work? No? Okay, I'll point it. No, I can just point it out by hand. This is the women's gallery. Behind it, there was a sort of false wall. And into that area were dropped over centuries, over hundreds and hundreds of years, bits and pieces of books, of paper, detritus, flotsam, jetsam. It all ended up in this one location. Now, normally speaking, a synagogue has a repository for the Geniza, or for what is often colloquially termed a Shemus box. Shemus because the names of God are the ones that biblically need to be preserved in this type of fashion. But in most of Europe, where Jews had lived for centuries, these repositories, over the years, as a result of the climate or as a result of expulsion, would have disappeared. The Middle East has a temperate climate, and the Jews in Cairo had been in situ for centuries. The synagogue had been a working shul for hundreds and hundreds of years, and therefore this Geniza was preserved thanks to nature and thanks to various other elements that can't be predicted and that can't be created. It's not the only one by far. There were a number of others which ended up swelling the amount of documents that are currently in the Cambridge Library from the original 190,000 that Solomon Schechter brought back at the end of the 19th century to approximately 300,000 that are there today. There are various other collections that have added to it. But if we go on to the next slide, I hope it is the next slide, yes. I don't know how well you can see this one. This is a pretty easily discerned mass of bits and pieces of paper, of documentation. Some of the stuff that came out of the Cairo Geniza was scrunched up, because when you're going to throw something away, you're not exactly going to do so with any care. You aren't aware that 800 years later, somebody might be interested in your shopping list. So you just scrunch it up and chuck it. What else would you do with it? And when enough of these things form a nice large ball, you'll throw the whole thing in, and okay, why not? It is as they would say in English, a dustbin or a garbage can. That's really what you're using it for. So this is still pretty good in comparison to what greeted Solomon Schechter when he had to cart all of these documents back to Cambridge. And towards the end this evening, so around midnight, I will speak about what modern technology has done to allow a number of fragments that were extracted from the Geniza and were previously illegible to have become legible in the 21st century. So, a Geniza, therefore, is a repository. This particular Geniza lasted throughout centuries. In fact, there are pieces there which are over 1,000 years old, so we can talk about the millennia. Why was it discovered in 1896? So the truth is that in vague terms, it was known about prior to Solomon Schechter. People knew that this synagogue had things that had been discarded throughout the generations, but there was hesitation in approaching it. Firstly, it was full of dust, and it wasn't exactly easy to access, geographically located, squashed between two walls, and then there was the fact that the various gaboim of the synagogue warned you off by telling you that there was a coiled serpent waiting for those who would trespass into this Geniza. And there were imprecations and curses that would befall anyone who dared open this portal into whatever word they supplied, which I'm in polite company, so I won't go too far. But you can imagine, therefore, that first of all, the requisite bakshish was required even to get in to having a glimpse of the Geniza, and to actually take some of it away would require persistence, perseverance, a charming manner, in addition to the aforementioned bakshish. So most people who had a passing interest in the Geniza left it as a passing interest, especially since no one quite knew what they would get even if they persevered. They might come away with a whole heap of documents only to discover the second half of somebody's shopping list, an unanswered love letter which still had the B'siyata Dishmaya at the top, hence making it a candidate for the Geniza. They didn't know if they'd find anything of value whatsoever. And therefore, more or less, it wasn't worth the bother. There were fragments making their way onto the black market because some of the members of the synagogue sort of helped themselves over time, and they would take a bunch of these documents, not knowing themselves what they were or whether they had value, and it sort of, made its way within the shuk, within the marketplace of Cairo, and then towards the end of the 1870s, we can talk about it making an impact within the Middle East, and then word starts spreading. What hurried these things along was that Cairo got a facelift in the 1880s due to cotton walls and Manchester and Leeds not being able to supply enough for various complicated economic reasons. Cairo ended up getting a facelift, which included the Ibn Ezra Synagogue. And in order to give it a facelift, they emptied out the entire contents of the Geniza and dumped it in the courtyard, where it lay. Nowadays we shudder when we think about it, but it lay exposed to the weather, to the vagaries of anybody coming along, and that obviously increased the amount of documents that made their way out of Egypt into various people's collections. To Budapest, there was a guy called Kaufmann, to Oxford, where there was a guy called Neubauer. It started making waves across the academic community because you were now seeing at least fragments published, written by people like Maimonides. The Rambam's handwriting was known, and you could see and identify that these were pieces of interest. Okay. What then happens is that some of the more academically inclined travelers end up in Cairo. You have a famous Karaite scholar called Abraham Firkovich, who passes through Cairo and who buys quite a haul of documents. But even when I say quite a haul, 500, 1,000, in comparison to the 190,000, it's a drop in the ocean. Nevertheless, it's a sizable amount. Nowadays, each one of those, if they had provenance and if we knew who they were written by, would fetch a very tidy sum. So someone like Firkovich walks off with quite a number of these documents. There are others. Yaakov Safir, a little bit earlier, tried to get hold of these documents, but he tried to get in through the roof of the synagogue, but there was too much in blocking his access, so sadly he went away without any of the goods that he was looking for. There was a guy called Shlomo Aaron Wertheimer, who was a Dayan or a Meretzedek in Jerusalem, originally born in Bratislava, what was originally Preshburg. He came to Yerushalayim and lived in Bote Ungarin, near Mea Sharim. Nowadays the whole area is referred to as Mea Sharim. And he was a self-taught academic. Self-taught not only in the sense that he was able to recognize people's handwritings and understand what they are writing about, but self-taught in the sense that he spoke many languages that he had not grown up with. The problem that plagued him was poverty. So even if he scraped together enough money to buy a few of these fragments and could correctly identify them, in order to be able to publish, he needed basically to sell them on. And you find postcards that he writes specifically to Oxford, to Professor Neubauer, where he's haggling over the cost of postage. And we're talking about fragments which are of incalculable value. But he doesn't have enough money, and therefore he has to sell them on. And he, unsurprisingly, was very, I guess bitter is the right word, about the fact that he wasn't given the ability nor the recognition for what he had achieved. And he writes in Hebrew, Ani hayisi az harishain. I was the first. Asher gilisi oitzres chayshech. I revealed these troves of darkness. Matmune mistare kisve yad. And I was the first one to publish them. And yet he did not get the recognition for it. Which means that by the time we come to the 1890s, we're now only really down to two players. And that is Professor Neubauer and Professor Solomon Schechter. One is in Oxford and one is in Cambridge. Now, Solomon Schechter was a very interesting individual. Without question, Rabbi Dunner will know more about him, both his provenance and his life. But insofar as his involvement with the Geniza, he was on the fringes of society in Cambridge, for the simple reason that he was Jewish. And Cambridge had been, since the 13th century, a mainstay of Christianity. The universities were created by the church. The land to this day is owned by the church. And it's very little difference in Oxford or Cambridge all the way through the centuries. So he was a little bit out of the club. He also was somewhat of an absent-minded professor. He would wear mismatched socks. And he was, a colourful figure. And an identifiably obvious one on the Cambridge scene. He was originally from Romania, descendants of Hasidic parentage, and he now was traditional, I guess is the way to define it. He was very friendly with two women who also were on the fringes of society. On the fringes because they were female. The first time Oxbridge awarded degrees to women, Oxford and Cambridge, any guesses? When was the first time a woman could reasonably lay claim to a degree in Oxford or Cambridge?
Queen Victoria.
1947 was the first time, which means that these two women were never going to be part of the mainstay of Cambridge. They were allowed into the library, but that's basically as far as it went. And these two women were sisters. One was called Mrs. Gibson and one was called Mrs. Lewis. And they were nicknamed the Gibloos. They had been brought up by their father to speak all the Romance languages, so Italian and French and its origins in Latin, as well as obviously English. And they'd been given a broad education by their father. Both of them had married. In both cases, their husbands predeceased them by quite a number of years. And they had an inheritance. And they were adventurous. So alongside traveling Western Europe, they decided to get into the archaeological game. And they end up learning Arabic and various other languages of note, but not Hebrew, not really anyway. And they discover the oldest Syriac version of the New Testament, which was a language that was very much in use in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries in the Middle East. Nowadays is basically a fossilized language. But they discovered it in a monastery in the Sinai desert. So they were making a little bit of a name for themselves. And they were self-funded. And of course, as soon as they came back to Cambridge, they're back on the fringes of society again because they're female. So they're very friendly with Solomon Schechter. And they come back in 1896 from a voyage to Egypt and what was then known as Palestine. And they tell Solomon Schechter, "We've brought you back stuff. We're sure you're going to be interested in it. We can't really read it because it's in Hebrew." So can we have a look at the next slide, please? No, sorry, let's go another one. Another one further. Okay. They brought him back this. This is Ben Ezra. What is Ben Ezra? Or to give it its Latin name, Ecclesiasticus. And by that name, you already understand that it must be somewhat related to Ecclesiastes. Otherwise, it wouldn't have the pronoun which is so similar. Ben Ezra was a book written sometime during the Second Temple period. The Talmud makes reference to it, as do the early commentaries, Rashi, etc. We're not exactly sure when. Was it at the very beginning of the Second Temple period, or maybe a couple of hundred years in? And this was always known in Jewish circles, that it was of Jewish authorship written during the Second Temple period. It then gets translated into Greek, as of course all of these writings, both the Old Testament, quote-unquote, and the Apocrypha, those books that did not make it into the Tanakh as such, they all get translated into Greek. And then Ben Ezra in Hebrew disappears. You cannot find it after the 9th, perhaps 10th century. It is mentioned continuously throughout the Middle Ages, but no one has a copy in Hebrew. Now, it happens to be that Solomon Schechter was an expert in Ben Ezra, and he was intent on proving that Ben Ezra was a Hebrew book, because the church, as a result of the fact that Ben Ezra disappeared in Hebrew, lay claim to Ben Ezra as being theirs, as being a Christian work. Of course, in order to be a Christian work, it would have to have been written post the Second Temple, but the Jews couldn't contradict it because they didn't have any physical evidence to show that it was, in fact, a Hebrew work. Until now. Until the Giblus brought back these documents in 1896 from Cairo, showed them to Solomon Schechter, who recognizes it immediately. And he is able to prove that it is in fact a Hebrew work because he is able to show that the translations into Greek are much more forced, are much more labored. They're not as natural, they're not as free-flowing, and therefore it's clear that it originally was a Hebrew book. Now, there was more at stake here than simply proving the provenance of a single volume. It was an opportunity to stick, depending on which culture you are from, one or two fingers up at the Christian academics in Oxbridge, because they were interested, they had a vested interest in making a break in history between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Meaning, they would say that post the era of prophecy, the Jews went into retreat, and during the entire Second Temple period, they didn't produce anything of interest until Jesus came along. And he was able to revive this tradition of education, of writing. But the Jews were hopeless. And he gave impetus to books like Ben Ezra. He didn't author it, but he gave impetus to it. The Jews were desperate to find a bridge between the old and the new. And Ben Ezra is one of those works that shows that in this alleged gap, there was actually fruitful activity in the field of literature. So it was of real interest to Schechter to prove this Ben Ezra document. And it has various, the style has aphorisms which are similar to Ecclesiastes, which is where it gets its title from. If we move to the next slide, if you are ever, I'm just going to take a drink actually. If you are ever fortunate enough to find yourself in Cambridge and make an appointment and get to see some of the documents of the Geniza collection, they are very likely to show you this one, which was not discovered in Cairo, nor was it authored in the Middle East. This is a letter written by Solomon Schechter to the Giblus a few hours after he has been shown these documents. And it is, here you see University Library of Cambridge, the 13th of May, 96. We, of course, mean 1896. And he says as follows: Dear Mrs. Lewis, I'm not sure why she was the one, maybe she was the one that gave him the documents in the High Street. I believe we have reason to congratulate ourselves for the fragment of something represents a piece of the original, which is underlined, Hebrew of Ecclesiasticus. He is highly excited by this. He is excited, as they say in Yiddish, areis fin kelim. He actually can't contain his excitement. Do not speak about this. He doesn't want anybody to know about this because he is on the cusp of a major discovery. By the way, one of the people that he definitely did not want to find out about this was his colleague, Jewish colleague in Oxford, Professor Neubauer, because he wanted to get the scoop. In the event, what happens is that Neubauer publishes the first elements of the Ben Ezra based on the Geniza, and therefore Neubauer thinks he's got the scoop until Schechter brings back 190,000 documents and buries Oxford in it. And to this day, Oxford has a far larger Judaica library, far larger. But in this one element of the Geniza, it is eclipsed. They have maybe 10,000 documents in Oxford, and nowadays 190,000, 300,000 in total nowadays in Cambridge. And he says, I will speak with you tomorrow about 11 p.m., but of course he means 11 a.m. You would not be visiting to unmarried women at 11 o'clock at night in Cambridge in 1896. That would have stirred up the rumour mills for decades to come. In haste and great excitement, yours sincerely, S. Schechter. This is where it all starts. And he says, I've got to get there. I've got to go to Cairo. Now, nowadays, the unit in the library in Cambridge is called the Taylor-Schechter Geniza unit. Taylor was a part of the clergy, part of the Christian clergy in Cambridge, and an academic, and he financed Solomon Schechter's trip. And Solomon Schechter gets a letter from the British Chief Rabbi Adler, and off he goes. He ends up in Cairo, and he has to deal with layers upon layers of bureaucracy, and you name it, he has to deal with it. And it wipes him out, as you can see from the correspondence that he sends back to his wife. And he has to deal with the British, with the French, because at that time, nominally, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, part of the Turkish Empire, but the Turkish Empire was known as the sick man of Europe. Its empire was already in almost terminal state of collapse, and the larger empires were all vying for bits of it, which is why, for instance, in Yerushalayim, every one of these major powers had their own large set of buildings. The Russian compound, nowadays the police station, was obviously where the Russians were. The Germans had what became the Schneller army base in Geula. That was their area. The Italians had theirs, but that was destroyed during the War of Independence. The French had their area because everyone was trying to lay claim once the empire collapsed. In fact, when Mea Shearim was originally conceived, they made sure that of all the people who were given a house in this very small unit, there was one who was Austrian, there was one who was British, there was one who was French, there was one who was a Russian, because that way, whatever happens, they're covered. That's how they created this settlement. So this is what Schechter has to do battle with while he's there. But he manages to get permission to take the entire lot back. And he does so. Crates it up, carts it back to Cambridge. Although, this is now 1897, within a few years, he will have left to come to the United States. And it was only a few years after that he will actually pass away. And most of the stuff will lie in crates unopened for decades. It's too much for anybody to deal with, and no one has that zeal to actually do something about it anyway, which is a shame because it means that some of those documents start decaying. But eventually, they do start looking into it and publishing. However, they are only interested in what you might call religious texts. So they're interested in things written by Maimonides, or by his son, Rabbeinu Avraham ben Harambam, who probably we know more about from the Geniza than any other single source. And they are interested in literature that will help create more of a developed religious corpus. In fact, if we can go back 2 slides a moment. One more, please. There we are. This is a document signed by the Rambam, written, in fact, and signed by the Rambam. There are quite a few documents in the Geniza that are signed by Maimonides, but a scribe has written it. It's a far more legible handwriting. The Rambam scrawled. he had so much to do and had so much to write that one can hardly blame him for taking the shorthand way out of dealing with his correspondence.
He was a doctor, so he had an illegible...
Right, yes, yeah. Although that was an affliction that came to him later in life, so maybe it's semi-legible. And you can see here, Moshe ben Rav Maimon Zatzal, which means his father has already died, so we can date this document as being post-1165, which is when he comes to first Alexandria and then Fustat in the first place. But this is a letter written by Maimonides. The interesting... Sorry? It's written by then on paper. Yes, they had moved, they'd made the transition. And it's written in Judeo-Arabic, which means Hebrew letters, the aleph base, but the words are all in Arabic. There are a number of people who I took, rabbis of note, who I took to the Geniza in Cambridge. One was one of my teachers, Moshe Shapira Zatzal, and one was Dayan Ehrentreu Zatzal, who recently passed away. In both cases, you could see that at a certain stage, they fell in love with the place, and they were just enraptured by what they were given to view. But there was a certain frustration, because they're holding, and literally holding, I mean, there's a plastic, but that's it. They're holding things that Maimonides wrote, but they can't read it because it's in Arabic. Now, this unit to this day has maybe 5 people working there. Of the 5, 2 are Jewish, 3 are not. The head of the unit is not Jewish, a guy called Ben Ezra, wonderful fellow, but he is absolutely fluent in modern Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, in Arabic. So, he picks up this responsa of Maimonides, and he goes, yeah, Allah, what the Rambam is saying is that the cheese, because it wasn't placed on the same plate as the meat, is perfectly kosher. And he has a working knowledge of Jewish law, of the Mishnah. I took a group of yeshiva students to this place. And, initially they're thinking, okay, what does this guy know? And he's quoting, the Mishnah in Shabbos and the version in the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli, and they are taken aback by this because how does he know this stuff? But that's what he does with his life. So you've got things like that which get published much earlier on because there's an interest in it. If we can now go, we're going to have to go back down a few and another one. Okay, we'll skip that one. Go to the next one. Right. We have here, you can't necessarily see the writing from where you are standing. It's a mezuzah, and therefore, as every mezuzah has, it's got the first two paragraphs of the Shema. Just by the way, we've now covered about a quarter of what I'm going to say, so as I say, trust you still are very comfortable here. So this is the first 2 paragraphs of the Shema, but there are 2 very interesting things on it. The first is names of angels on a parchment scroll of a mezuzah, which you might think covers you for third-party fire and theft, except it's forbidden in halacha, and the Rambam particularly writes, it is forbidden in halacha to write the names of angels on a mezuzah, because the whole point of the mezuzah is that God guards the house, and when you are now deferring to angels, what you're saying is, yeah, God does an okay job, but if you really want secure protection, write these names down. Right? So this is an invalid scroll, but it would only have been invalidated after the Rambam's crusade, although I guess that is perhaps the wrong word to use in the Middle Ages, in the Middle East, in the time that the Rambam lived. But either way, it was after the Rambam specified that these cannot be used. The other thing of interest is at the very bottom here, there are 4 Magen Davids, 4 Stars of David. To the best of my knowledge, this is the earliest use of the Magen David in a Jewish setting. Now, the Star of David, or the pentagram, the hexagram, as it stands, was used in Christianity alongside Judaism. No one really knows the origins of it. No one knows where the Jews sort of first adopted it. But there is a synagogue, or part of a synagogue, that still remains in Budapest, at Buda on the other side of the river, where you have a Magen David, but that's from the 14th century. So this is earlier. This is 11th century. You're looking here at a piece of parchment which is almost 1,000 years old. But it got published early on because it's of religious value. If we can move to the next slide, you have here possibly my favorite piece in the Geniza, and that is a 2-page extract of the Haggadah. There are so many interesting things about it, but I'm just going to point out a few. The first is it's written in 3 languages. You have Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. Right? Those are the 3 languages that are going to be there. So, over here, you have got the end of Kiddush. But this end is actually for a Kiddush that is on Motzei Shabbos. So it's Havdalah Kiddush. It ends not quite as, definitely not as Ashkenazim do it today, and most Sfaradim, but it talks about here Kedushas Shabbos and Kedushas Yom Tov, but it adds the phrase Va'avdel eschem min ha'amim lios li. I will separate you from the nations of the world. Okay. Baruch atah Hashem hamavdil ben kodesh lekodesh. So that bit in Hebrew. Then you get instructions in Arabic to do the next bit. So here you have something that says, well, the words in Hebrew say Berei Pri Ha'adama, right? You take your potato, they weren't using the potato in the Middle East, right? You take your Hadama, and you, interestingly, the Rambam is of the opinion, we Ashkenazim have less than a kazayit of karpas, in order not to have to make an after blessing, in order not to have to make a ber nefashos. He specifically says, no, but you make a ber nefashos, so you have more than a kazayas. But that first bit is in Hebrew. The instructions are in Arabic. I'll come back to this a second. And here at the very bottom, you have it in Aramaic. So that's one interesting thing on this 2-page fragment of the Haggadah. But there's something else very interesting. This is, of course, the most famous piece of the Haggadah. It's the 4 questions, except it isn't. It's the 5 questions. There's a 5th question here. The question is one that is very legitimate, because if you look at the 10th chapter of the tractate Psachim, they tell you the 4 questions that were asked when the temple stood, and one of them was that on all other nights we eat meat, whether it's cooked or roasted or boiled or whatever, and on this night we only have roasted meat when the temple stood. The way this one puts it down is when there once was a temple, we only had roasted meat, whereas on all other nights we had meats made and presented in various forms. So there are 5 questions in this Haggadah, and then you have the translation into Aramaic, Maishna Leila Hodain, which is the Aramaic of Ma Nishtana Halayla Hazeh. Okay, let's carry on. This for many years was my little avatar on WhatsApp. This is an extract from Maimonides' Mirror Nevuchim. It's all his handwriting. There's tons of stuff in his own handwriting. And by the way, to contrast Maimonides with Rashi, they live within a century of each other. Rashi is born in 1040, dies 1105. Maimonides is born 1135 and dies in 1204, 100 years later. Of the Rambam's own handwriting, we have entire volumes. Of Rashi's handwriting, not one word. We do not possess a single word in Rashi's original handwriting. Give you a contrast between Ashkenazim and Sfardim, gives you a contrast between what the Cairo Geniza did for us and what would happen were the German or French climate to have been more temperate, but it isn't. So, this is chapter 64 of Guide to the Perplexed, of Moreh Nevuchim. Even though it's in Arabic, and therefore I have no idea how to read it, whenever Maimonides writes a verse from the Torah in there, he writes it in Hebrew. I found this verse, put it through my Bar Ilan, and discovered that there's only one chapter in which he writes it, and hence I know this is chapter 64. But that's not the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is this little bit here. There are no chapter breaks in his original Moreh Nevuchim. So I thought that this serves as a chapter break. And Ben says to me, no. If you look closely, you will see that this is a lighter black and this is a darker black, especially that first sentence after the squiggle. The Rambam's pen was running out of ink. He refilled his pen and did a doodle with it to make sure that the pen was working. So forget all his halachic stuff and all the rest of it, the doodle of the Rambam. Now, you can't analyze it using Freud or Jung or any one of that nature, because every century people's handwritings change to such a degree that we can't use graphology or any other means to find out what the Rambam subliminally was trying to tell us. But a fascinating extract nonetheless. Let's go down. I don't think we're going to be looking at the next one. Oh, we'll go beyond that. What happens then, post-World War II, in the 1950s, is they start becoming interested in the social element of the Geniza. Here you have a part of a document written by a kid learning to write the Aleph base, doing exactly what our kids are doing today. Except instead of a drawing of a Ferrari or a Maserati, he's on his souped-up camel, because that's what he is drawing on his exercise book in the classroom. And what we have today is a perfectly preserved system of education. It's exactly the same. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. More things change, the more we realize, actually, it's exactly as it was. And that is part of the social history that comes to the fore. Can we move to the next one, please? There are not many left. This is a ksuba. It's dated 1383, which means that it was written in 1071, obviously. Dating of documents. In the Christian world, they adopted year 1, year 0, and today would be 2023. But in the Muslim world, before Islam became the dominant religion, Jewish documents dated themselves using a system called minyan shtaris, which goes back to the times of Alexander the Great, and therefore it's 312 BCE. So if this is 1383, minus 312 years, and you get to the date of this ksuba, 1071. What's fascinating about this ksuba is that it is a marriage between what was called a rabbinite Jew, which means what we now call an Orthodox man, and a Karaite woman. So the Karaites didn't believe in the oral law at all. But they were very much present in the Middle East, and especially in Egypt. In fact, when Maimonides arrives in Egypt, of 150 families living in Cairo, 100 are Karaite and 50 are Rabbinite. So this is, the guy is Orthodox, she is Karaite. Now, We know from other documents about this guy, because he was the son of the president, so he was quite an important dude. We know from other documents that he had been engaged to another girl. And he did something which would never happen nowadays. He got disengaged to that first girl because this girl, despite being a Karaite, had lots of money. So, as I say, it wouldn't happen nowadays, but it did apparently happen 1,000 years ago, and they got married. But what's fascinating is that, first of all, this ksuba has got, you can't see them all, but there are dozens of signatures there. There are Karaite rabbis and Orthodox rabbis. Everybody's in on the act. This was a big wedding, clearly. But the document is enormously long because it contains all the conditions that exist in order for this marriage to work. Karaites do not allow a flame to burn through Shabbat, even if you lit it before Shabbat. So it says here, he should not expect any warm food on a Shabbat. Right? Because there is no way for her to produce warm food for him on Shabbat. She can't keep something warm. Right? And there's all sorts of conditions. I can't imagine that this marriage lasted. But this is a document almost 1,000 years old. Now, there are one of the most fascinating areas, and I've nearly finished, you'll be pleased to know. One of the most fascinating areas is prenups, but not as we know them. In the Middle East, it was quite accepted to have more than one wife. What we are unaware of is the fact that often the first wife, when she got married, would create a prenup which said, you cannot marry a second wife unless I give the okay. And there are dozens and dozens of these documents. There's one prenup which is hilarious. It says you have to stop hanging out with your drunken friends, you have to be home by a particular hour, etc., etc. Otherwise, I want my ketubah, I'm out of the marriage. And the interesting thing is that most of these prenups are drawn up by the woman, not by the man. So, we might have in our head that women in the Middle East, especially in Jewish society, what sort of say did they have? The Geniza documentation opens up a social world. Women who were running fleets of ships, trading as far as India. A woman who got kicked out of the synagogue because of her behavior, but still remained a donor to the synagogue. Rabbi Dunner, any comment on that? And so you have just fascinating social history. One other one, these are all in the Middle East. There is an exchange between a mother and a son in Yiddish. Right? Out of the 190,000 documents, that's it for Yiddish. I mean, who's going to be writing Yiddish there? And the mother, who's living in Jerusalem by then, she's from Prague originally, this is in the middle of the 1500s, she writes to her son who's living in Cairo, you don't write, you don't call, etc., etc. A Jewish mother. Interestingly, she does approve of his wife, so she's okay with her daughter-in-law. And in fact, she's even suggesting a shidduch. It's fascinating. So interesting how the world is doing things back then very similar to what we're doing today. Now, what is happening now in the 21st century? So you can move to the next slide. So, have a look at this document, and you can see this is almost invisible. You can't read almost anything there. Press once more. And this is the document with all the words using ultraviolet. So this is something that they have achieved through technology. An illegible document becomes fully legible. More than that, let's go on to the next document. Here you have a tshuva, a responsa from the Go'enim. The only thing is that it is in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 7 pieces, I believe. And those 7 pieces, 2 of them are in JTS, 1 of them is in Oxford, 3 of them are in Cambridge, because, there's 10,000 documents in the JTS, 10,000 in Rylands, in Manchester, another 10,000 in Oxford. And you're halfway through this document, and, well, first of all, you wouldn't assume that the other half survived. It got torn, it got thrown out, maybe it isn't there at all. And even if it did, how the heck are you ever going to find it? So there was an individual in Toronto who gave the Geniza unit $1 million to digitize all the Geniza documentation. And if we move to the other side, the way they actually identified it was on the back of these things. They used to reuse these things, especially if they're made out of parchment. And here you have a decree written by a bigwig, somebody of importance in the Arab world. That's why there's lots of spacing, because he has to show that he's wealthy and doesn't need this stuff, and he can afford to write just 1 word per, per piece. And here, it reads much more easily. And you can see that this is the opposite side of that. So now, they manage, through digitization, literally to move the pieces together and find it, because now all you have to do is follow the thread of 1 sentence rather than the thread of all this exhaustive discussion. And that's one of the things that they are doing to this very day, which is why they're still finding things that they did not know about back then. But all in all, not sure what the next slide is, but let's have a look at it anyway. Okay, yes, I suppose it's worth mentioning at this moment, I have a podcast called History for the Curious, in which I have a 4-part series on the Geniza. Most of what I said tonight will not be in there. In fact, about 80% of what I said tonight won't be in there, and this is, each part will be about 30 to 35 minutes. Of further discoveries of the Geniza and further elements that can be found therein. Rabbi Duna.
So I just want to end by saying that Rabbi Hersh has a wonderful podcast, History for the Curious. I've listened to it, I enjoy it. It contains wonderful information. It's the way he does it is he interacts with somebody else on the topic of historical importance and historical interest, particularly Jewish history. So I would highly recommend it, and hopefully you'll be able to listen to it and subscribe to it. And if you want more information, don't be shy to ask. And I would like to take this opportunity of once again thanking Mount Sinai Memorial Park for their sponsorship, and more importantly, to thank Rabbi Hersh for his incredibly wonderful presentation this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.